A mesa é intitulada A Crise e a Guerra, Segurança Pública, Direitos e Diferença. A gente vai ter a participação dos professores Jorge Bichara, do professor René Levi, do professor Paulo Amar e os comentários do professor Paulo Gabriel, aqui do PPGA. Eu tenho alguns informes para dar. O primeiro informe é que hoje, na verdade, temos um aniversariante na mesa, é o professor Amar. Então, saudações ao professor Paulo. E que, mais tarde, nós já, a partir do restaurante Bendito, uma incrível participação no show do professor Jorge Bichara, que vai apresentar o seu novo álbum para a gente de blues. Estamos uma banda. Então, todos estão convidados a partir das 8 horas no restaurante Bendito, de São Francisco. Bem, vamos sair depois da mesa. Então, não se aposte hoje. Bem, então, para começar, George.
It is always a great pleasure and honor to be here at INEAC with my good friends, my intellectual home away from home. I know that this is also a period of challenge and uncertainty in Brazil. It was particularly appropriate to be here and show my solidarity and concern. And of course, I know INEAC is going to outlive any administration and is going to prosper in the years ahead. So the title of my talk today is Law Against the People, or The Empire Strikes Back. And my main goal, it will be to describe and analyze how supporters of Israeli state policies have, year 2000, used legal forms traditionally thought of as tools of the powerless against entrenched power. Israeli state policies have instead used tools to defend and advance those state policies. It's to use law against the people. The Empire Strikes Back part to the title, because for the most part, Israel's appropriation of what we as progressive legal instruments, doctrines, and organizational forms become in response and others' earlier attempts, 70s and early 80s, to deploy legal strategies to achieve Palestinian goals through the framework of human rights. In other words, what I will talk to you about today, what I will describe to you briefly today, primarily as a reaction to or even a retaliation against Palestinians' efforts to mobilize law to their benefit. Indeed, Israel's supporters have coined a term, or more accurately, have borrowed a term to describe legal efforts. That term is lawfare, like warfare, but with law. See such efforts. I'll say more about this in a little bit. Now, when I talk about this as the Empire Striking Back, of course, I'm invoking the famous Star Wars movies. I don't mean in doing that to make light, because in reality, behind the legal actions that I'm describing, there's a lot of concrete human suffering. And I for sure don't mean to in any sense. But there is an element of irony in the fact that we, and I mean by that supporters of Palestinian rights like myself, to introduce law to our struggle. And now we find ourselves possibly being beaten at our own game. This contest, and now we're suffering the consequences. You can see this presentation today as a sequel to two presentations or interventions that I've made in the past. The first one was a talk that I gave, which was later published as an article in Dilemma's journal, and that was called Violence's Law. Years ago, when I was here, I gave a talk that I called Entrancement and Estrangement, Phases in the Palestinian Legal Struggle for Rights. And I'm going to, because I know you were not all present at either of those two talks, and may not have read the article, probably have not, I am going to just give you a very brief recap of what I said. Violence's Law, in that talk and the article, I reviewed Israel's campaign beginning in the year 2000, currently violate certain principles of international humanitarian law, international law that governs the conduct of military forces during war, that their practices be accepted as new norms of customary international law. I think I better not go into detail at this point about that campaign, but if you're curious about more details of that, please ask me. So today's presentation is a sequel to Violence's Law in the sense that it puts Israel's attempts to transform international humanitarian law and limit its uses of extreme military power, particularly in the Gaza Strip, into a broader context. In other words, it shows that that effort to transform a certain body of law that was designed to protect civilians into greater military force against civilians, singular phenomenon. It is part of a broader instead. And that, as I will try to show, is the inversion of law intended to protect the powerless in such a way as to authorize and expand the exercise of power. This today is a sequel to my talk 2 years ago, in the sense that it fills out a historical chronology. I described a period of enchantment among, supporters of Palestinian rights with law, and particularly with the human rights framework. And I talked about working with the first Palestinian human rights organization, or non-governmental organization, NGO for short, in the early 80s. There was this sense of expectation and excitement that law could deliver and rights. And I described how that movement led to engagement, that is, people, and they documented human rights abuses in Israeli occupied territories primarily. They actually litigated, that is, they took cases to court. And what I described was a record of very limited, in fact, for the few victories that were achieved by supporters of Palestinian rights, there were many other losses. And that led to a third phase of estrangement, or feeling distant from and critical of uses of law, phase that continues today. So what today's talk, how today's talk relates to that technology is, it shows that the cynicism and the estrangement that people feel, that Palestinians and their supporters feel, the reasons for this cynicism are not just, but also the successes of those who have been in those areas of law to Israeli state policies. So I'm going to do that sampling the work of 3 pro-Israel non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. One is called Shurat Hadin, or the Israel Law Center. Another one is called Regavim, which means lots of land, small pieces of land. Is called the Lawfare Project. Let me just tell you quickly about what these groups. The first one, Shurat Hadin, was established in Tel Aviv in 2003. And interestingly, its leader, an Israeli woman lawyer, described being inspired by to establish Shurat Hadin by the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Poverty Law Center was founded in Montgomery, Alabama in 1971 with the objective of using civil litigation, that means not public prosecution, but lawsuits for damages in US courts to combat racist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, which I imagine you've probably heard about. Shurat Hadin describes itself as a legal defender of Israel and Jewish interests internationally. Slogan's is that it is bankrupting terror one lawsuit at a time. It uses civil litigation. Like I said, that means not prosecutions for criminal acts, but rather lawsuits private individuals file in court against other private individuals, typically, in courts throughout the world to combat what they call, what I earlier referred to as lawfare. And as I said, this is a term that has been popularized by pro-Israel groups to depict Palestinians' attempts to mobilize law to advance their rights, which they, that is the pro-Israel side, see as a perversion of or a manipulation of human rights law to attack Western democracies, of which Israel is one. Suits, Shurat Hadin suits, are relatively frivolous. So, for example, former US president, that is Jimmy Carter, wrote a book in the early 2000s that was called Israel, Peace or Apartheid. And the book basically warned that if Israel didn't conclude peace and a two-state solution with Palestinians, it would become an apartheid state. Shurat Hadin sued Jimmy Carter, New York State, and under consumer protection law, basically saying that, you know, he purported to be a former president and an expert, and what he public by writing this book was essentially consumer fraud because it didn't deliver what it was supposed to. That suit didn't go anywhere. It was thrown out of court early. But organization filed a suit against the Palestine Liberation Organization and the the Palestinian Authority, seeking damages for injury and deaths to American citizens that were caused during the Second Intifada. That's the second uprising that went roughly from late 2000 to 2006. The jury trial in 2015, early 2015, in federal court in New York, and it resulted in a favorable verdict. In other words, they won the case, and they earned a judgment in the amount of $655 million. The court, in this case, relied on a form of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means the the power or the authority of a court to hear a case, and extraterritorial means outside of the borders of where the court is sitting. This kind of extraterritorial jurisdiction had previously been used by left liberal groups within the US, former officials of right-wing regimes, mostly in Latin America, for torture and other crimes against their people. Now, even to add that this verdict has just been overturned by an appellate court just within the last couple of weeks. So the ultimate outcome, and it is likely to be appealed further still by the Shura had he filed the suit. But even to achieve this jury trial verdict was a huge success, and is in striking contrast to attempts by Palestinians in U.S. courts, which have been typically thrown out of court at very early stages of litigation on procedural grounds. Now let me tell you a little bit about the second of these groups, Regavim. So Regav, I don't speak Hebrew, but I understand from reading that Regav or Regev means a tiny piece of land, and Regavim is a plural of that, so it means tiny pieces of land. And this refers to the Zionist slogan that Palestine would be taken over dunam by dunam. Dunam is a quarter of an acre. I guess that's not acres here. Let's see. Anyway, it's a small piece of land. It's the local measure of land in the Middle East. Or Regav by Regav. In other words, slow creeping takeover of the land of Palestine. So indeed, this organization, it was founded in Jerusalem in 2006, and it describes its objectives, the lands of Israel, from illegal encroachment, both within Israel itself, areas that Israel has occupied since 1967. Of course, it doesn't use that term, occupied, since from their perspective, the extension of Israeli jurisdiction or power over those territories is in fact a redemption of the land and not an occupation. Now, this organization, the bulk of its funding from the municipal councils of Israeli settlements. Those are the communities that have been established in territory that has been in which Palestinian population, in which most of the world, the locus for a future Palestinian state. Regavim styles itself as a human rights NGO, non-governmental organization, for Israeli settlers. And it engages in advocacy and litigation to defend settler interests, both in the sense of fighting challenges to the legality of particular settlements, and also in encouraging Israeli authorities to demolish structures built by Palestinians without permits, nominally illegal. Let me just digress to give you text here in case you're not familiar with this situation. So, you know, Israeli military occupied the West Bank in 1967. That area under, to everybody else in the world, is occupied territory. It is illegal to settle there. And Israel has nonetheless permitted settlements under certain circumstances. So under Israeli law, some settlements are permitted, others are not. I'm gonna, sorry, okay. So this organization almost precisely mirrors the human rights discourse, the organizational form, evidence gathering, and the bodies of law that have typically been used on to protect Palestinian interests. So it is the settlers who are using this law and this discourse to legalize settlements. All right, let me tell you about the third of these groups. This is the one that it's called the Lawfare Project, which was founded in New York City in roughly 2010. It describes itself as the legal arm of the pro-Israel community and as a legal think tank that sponsors litigation and other legal action to protect civil and human rights of the pro-human rights and counter-terrorism communities. um, it has engaged in a wide variety of activities, but the main thing that I want to highlight for you here is its work against the Palestinian and international movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS as it's called for short, against Israel. Along with other allies, it has mounted campaigns in most of the 50 US states, and it has persuaded better than half of them, 26 states, for legislation or executive orders that bars BDS, that in some cases even criminalizes. And of particular note, for today anyway, is how this is framed, that is as anti-discrimination. In other words, the organization, in some cases, the actual legislation cites anti-discrimination law as the root or as the rationale underlying these bans of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, saying that it is anti-Semitic or discriminatory against the nation and people of Israel to single it out and to advocate its boycott. So this is essentially the same body of law that was adopted originally to combat racial discrimination against African Americans and Latino Americans and others. To sum up, because I don't have much time remaining, what we have seen here is international humanitarian law that has been used to expand the scope of violence against civilians. I didn't talk about that today. That was, as I said, violence is law presentation several years ago. We've seen human rights law, environmental law, consumer protection law, and other bodies of substantive law used to advance Israel's colonization of the West Bank. We have seen procedural devices such as extraterritorial jurisdiction used to attack Palestinian institutions. The organizational form and other technical aspects of human rights documentation and discourse mirrored by Israeli settlers, and all to significantly greater impact, that is, with much greater success than anything the Palestinians or their supporters have been able to achieve. So what does this all mean? What are we to make of this? Well, I don't feel confident to draw firm conclusions at this point, but one at least strongly suggested conclusion here, and seems obvious, is that it is much easier for groups in civil society to sail with the winds of current power than it is to sail against them. Take Regavim, the second of the three organizations I described to you. Surely there are differences within Israel over how to colonize Palestinian lands, but the fact of colonization is clearly supported and has been supported by all Israeli governments since 1967. One of the other organizations makes explicit its coordination with the Israeli government. That is, it works openly and directly. And I would be very surprised if the same were not true of the Lawfare Project, although I don't have direct evidence for it. So what I think is also suggested here is that there is very little leverage in substantive or procedural law itself that the relatively powerless can mobilize to their benefit. We are probably all of law as an instrument of power. That's not a surprise. That's not a new insight. Some of us, however, myself included, have at times comforted ourselves into thinking that there were corners of law that were ours, that were specifically for challenges to power by the powerless, at least. That seems not to be true, as we have seen precisely those areas as our refuge turned against us. far more thought and analysis is due before any of this can be turned into someone else. But an expression comes to mind, which is a sleeping beast. The meaning of, you know, if you use a short stick, when the beast awakes and attacks you back. So our mistake, I say this as a person who's been engaged in work on behalf of Palestinian rights for decades, may have been to trust a law disembodied from politics, to imagine that law could compensate for political weakness. And what we now may be learning is that there are no shortcuts. Law will not be our refuge. Legal victories, if we ever achieve them, will only develop as we build political muscle through long and outside of the legal system. In other words, courts will only rule for us when they must.
Thank you very much, George. Now, Professor René Levy.
Eu estou muito honorado de fazer parte desta sessão, mas eu gostaria de me desculpar de não poder falar em português. Suficiente em português, então eu vou falar em inglês. Obrigado. Okay, thank you. First of all, I wish to thank the organizers, especially Roberta, to me to share my thoughts with you. I've been to a number of these conferences over the years, and it's always a pleasure to, like for George just said, a pleasure to be here and to an opportunity to see old friends, and of course to be here in the current is also important. I'm going to speak about terrorism in France. As you may know, in the last few years, actually, we've experienced a wave of terrorist attacks linked to the situation in the Middle East, especially in Syria and Iraq, most of which are an organization that is called ISIS in English, Daesh in French, and I think Estado Islamico in Portuguese, has claimed responsibility. First such wave, France has a long experience domestic and foreign terrorism, including Islamic terrorism, but it has a number of specificities which affect both the interpretation of these events and the fight against the authors. So I should mention from the outset that I'm not a specialist of Islam nor of violent activism. My area, as some of you may know, my expertise is almost is mostly into policing. And the reasons why I developed an interest in this issue are twofold. First, to try to clarify my own ideas and take distance myself from the fear and shock that, as many other people in France, especially in Paris, I think they personally experienced in the wake of the last January and November 2015 attacks. And secondly, as a kind of a preliminary step to analyzing anti-terrorist public policies which derived from were redefined in the wake of these attacks, which is maybe something I'll do later on. So you shouldn't expect any grand theory about terrorism. This is a very exploratory and non-exhaustive some of the current analysis in France among French intellectuals and scholars who have done or haven't done any research in this area. So my paper will have three parts. I'll give a factual presentation of the events because I think perhaps a number of you are not aware of the extent of those events and their implications. Then I'll discuss current theories of so-called radicalization. And then I'll look at French debates regarding the role of Islam into this phenomenon. And finally, if I have time, I'll conclude with a few reflections regarding current challenges. I won't delve much into matters of definition. I'll take the very basic definition of terrorism and jihadism at this point, which you have on the slide. And I move immediately since I don't have much time for those events. Now, since 2012, France has suffered about 20 jihadist attacks of various scope, and a similar number have been foiled by the authority during that period. Actually, I heard that these days 2 more attempts have been prevented and people arrested with those attempts. The wave started in 2012 with the killing first of 3 soldiers, 3 French soldiers in uniform in the street, of Arab origin, and 1 black. He was a Caribbean, French Caribbean, in fact. And this is not chance killing. And then followed by 3 children and the father of 2 of them in a Jewish school in southern France. This all found place near a city called Toulouse in south France. And the author was called Mohamed Merah, who was later on killed by the police in an assault on his house. And it was the first such attack since 1996. From this slide, some of these attacks were among the most deadly in the last half century, especially, of course, 2015, with about 120 deaths and more than 400 wounded from shootings and suicide bombings, and that of more recently, Nice, where a guy with a truck ran over a crowd and killed 85 people and wounded more than 200. You see, there's a gap here between these 2 and the next most deadly attack, which was committed by a group that opposed Algerian independence during the Algerian independence. Now, of course, these attacks, the last attack actually occurred last July when 19 years old 2 guys, an 84-year-old priest during a religious service in a church. Another one had killed a couple of police officers in their home, year-old children. And it now appears that these 2 attacks were actually linked to those who have just been prevented, and they're all part of the same network. Now, of course, this is not isolated. On this slide, red line is the red shows the increase, the cumulated number of attacks claimed by ISIS, the inception of the so-called caliphate. I don't know if it's English, caliphate. So there were more than 200 attacks and more than 3,000 people killed in 28 countries. Now, what do we know about those who commit these attacks? Lots of public data, for lack of research, also because the authorities probably, well, they don't share what they know about it, but from various sources, get an idea of how many people are involved. On this slide, I've collected a number of they have to be taken with caution because, as I said, the sources and the methodology for establishing them is not always. Basically, it is felt that there were about 1,500 to 1,700 people who went to Syria, and there are still about 700 there, among which 40% women, which is quite significant. The number of people that have been by the police that have been recorded by the police as being in sympathy with jihadism, slide it says 10,500. The read that the government just raised the figure to 15,000. Which does not mean that these 15,000 people are constantly watched. It's just that they are, when the police comes across them, they're supposed to record, say, what they did. Anyway, France is the biggest provider of fighters to ISIS from Europe in absolute numbers. This one in relative numbers. With respect to the population. But of course, most come from Europe. They come from Central Asia or other Arab countries. We know a little bit more about the 22 who committed those attacks since they're young. In any case, the average age of those who go to fight to Syria is around 25. That's estimated. So all those 22 terrorists were in France, about 2/3 of them, at least. 60% of them had a prison experience previously, either for terrorism or for ordinary. Third, went to Syria or another country, jihad country, before committing their attacks. And what is interesting is that 90% were already known to the police, which raises two questions, which I can't now, but I just mention them. One is, of course, why did their preparation go undetected? No issue between the countries because some were known by the Belgian police, the others were known by the French police, and there obviously was a gap, an exchange of intelligence. So, come to committed those mass murders. And this takes me to my second point, which is about this radicalization. I'll define as the process through which a more or less ordinary person, normal person becomes a mass a jihadist, a killer, and this is a matter of debate in France. Scholars refuse the notion itself because they feel that Islamic radicalization should not be put into the same other forms of political or religious or extremism, or fanaticism. But this is a rather isolated position, and I think there is a consensus on how to address that issue. Now, first, I'd like to mention that it's not the first time in the 20th century young men volunteer to fight against the will of the government. Of course, the case that comes to mind immediately is the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where you have the international brigades of left-wing militants from all over Europe went to fight against Franco, but there are other examples also from the other side of the political spectrum during World War II on the Russian front with the Nazis, or more recently the Independence War in 1948, or in Nicaragua in 1979, Afghanistan, of course, or Bosnia in the 90s. So each of these conflicts has attracted a number of volunteers from other countries. And if one looks at the conditions of that are necessary in a way to attract volunteers to fight and to risk their lives, you can isolate from the literature four conditions, I think. A grand narrative, an ideological dimension, which is made of a grand narrative that opposes worldviews in very simplistic terms. And in the case of jihadism, of course, it's true believers, infidels, and the rhetoric is that of a conflict of civilization. Ironically, I think ISIS is the staunchest believer a conflict of civilization theory, actually, and they're trying to implement it. It is a concrete battlefield where a decisive battle appears to be in progress, where it seems that through one's personal engagement, one can take part into a historical. The third condition is of course the propaganda and logistic apparatus, the function of which is to gain new adepts and to bring them to the actual. And finally, fourth condition, there must be an available population. And although ISIS seems to be able to recruit some highly educated people, there is a broad consensus, at least for France and Belgium, that most of its members come from poorer neighborhoods, which are heavily populated with a migrant population of migrant origin, low level of education, delinquency, and crime, and which have been subjected to Islamic fundamentalist propaganda. As has been shown a long time ago by an American sociologist called Doug McAdam, the absence of personal, what he calls biographical availability, the absence of the lack of personal constraints like having a job, a family, children, etc., is a condition of such into high-risk activism. It in a completely different context. But of course, these structural conditions do not individual decisions. And if we look at more the micro-sociological processes of the dynamic of radicalization, here I have two definitions, which are by French authors, which are specialists in those quite close. What they point to is that it's not sufficient to have radical ideas. Radical ideas in themselves do not automatically lead to acting. It is necessary to have the ideas and the will to implement those ideas. The different ways to radicalization can be summed up in 4 or 5 points. The various processes that are at work here are, the first one is a step-by-step conversion process. As you see, most authors think that is merely a particular version of radicalism in general and of extreme thinking in general that can be analyzed from social science perspectives. So a step-by-step by which one progressively changes one's worldview, one's notion of good and wrong through minute sections, and finally leading to the conviction that violent action is legitimate or called for. This is usually combined with a change in sociability, because people who go through this kind of change usually get at odds with their family, their friends, etc., are not understood by those, and they tend to look for other more friendly circles, which of course reinforces their deviant ideas or their new ideas. And of course we recognize here something that is quite similar to the drift toward delinquency or crime that has been analyzed in other contexts by interaction in the interactionist perspective by people like Howard Becker or David Mesa. And I think we can talk of a jihadist career as there is a delinquent career, and actually, as we've seen in the French case, the jihadist career frequently follows career. Another way is through family socialization. Fast here. It is striking, but for instance, the number of siblings that are involved in all those attacks is absolutely striking. It was the case in New York in 9/11, in Boston, in Paris, in Brussels. Specialized a psychiatrist, French psychiatrist, said he was following 7 couples, brothers. So this is very specific, I think, here. Another way is through a group of friends. We have numerous examples of groups of friends moving together, after having for a while, and then they decide, and they all go to move to Syria. Some of them get killed, others return. So it's quite frequent. Another factor is frustration, resentment, a feeling of victimization, of discrimination, etc., which is within that jihadist discourse also troubled identity, because sometimes those young people they feel as strangers in France, but also as strangers in the country of origin of the parents. And ISIS provides a kind of transnational identity. It is a way, it's a kind of internationalism. Okay, I'll pass on the lone wolf thing, because it doesn't really exist, although it is discussed. And I'll move immediately to my last part, which is the role of Islam. And maybe what makes the current situation so special is that we're witnessing mass killings in the name of religious faith. Survivors in France are perhaps the first victims of religious fanaticism since the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th century. For the French who live in a deeply secularized society, incomprehensible. Before that, terrorism was motivated by various political reasons, and it was understandable and rational. But for the French, vast majority of the French, killing in the name of God can only be understood as sheer insanity. This is what I taking the expression by Bachelard or Bourdieu, I think is an epistemological obstacle, an intellectual roadblock that induces a number of scholars not to take religion seriously when they discuss jihadism. There are basically three ways to address the issue of Islam in the French debate. One is to say jihad has always been part. Islam is a conqueror of religion, and jihad has always been part of it. So, in a way, jihad is the essence of Islam. And although this is a minority view, in a way, it shares the view of Islam of the jihadists themselves as the true Islam. Then there is the debate, mostly the core of the current debate is two views. One, which is that jihadism is not really about Islam, and it's been called Islamized radicalism. And the other one is that it's radical Islam truly. Those who think that it's not really about religion, basically think that the people who go to jihad, they take up jihad because it's the only available radical thing on the intellectual market. At times they might have become revolutionary Marxists, but since Marxism is dead, they turn to jihad, and some say it's a radical form of extreme tourism. So this is a way not to take religion seriously, really. Among those who take religion seriously, there are those who have a traditional Buddhist view, blaming the West for everything that's happening in the Middle East. But I think the more interesting view is that of a scholar named Gilles Kepel, who is a specialist of Islam, who is actually among the small group of people who have an interest in this issue. All these discussions are among maybe a dozen people. The only one who speaks Arabic and who has direct access of one of the few ones, several, but is the main spokesperson for this trend. And it's interesting to note, I think, that those who miss the role of Islam actually are not specialists of Islam or don't speak Arabic and have no direct access to the sources, which is different for and he his view twofold. First, we have a conjunction of what's going on in the Middle East at the political and military situation, which has allowed the emergence of ISIS in the first place, but also deep changes in the Islamic world itself due to the influence of the Saudi version of Islam called Salafism, very fundamentalist, which has permeated Muslim communities. I think I've heard that they even active in Brazil. And also a conjunction of these two factors with changes within the French Islamic community. The notion of a French Islamic community can be discussed, but I don't have the time to do it. Anyway, in the French Islamic world, if you wish, through funding of imams, etc. So, on the other hand, he points to the fact that ISIS's strategy has been precisely outlined by a thinker called Mohammed al-Suri in the early 2000s, which was published on internet. He was Syrian, was later killed in Syria, I think, but lived in Spain at the time. Theorized neighborhood jihadism, with people from nowhere, you know, and attacking their neighbors, or you know, taking a truck and so these are the various. This is the intellectual current. I'll just finish with very briefly with the 4 challenges I see in the current situation for France. Short term, of course, there's a challenge of preventing attacks, and all of these various challenges are framed in very different time frames. Short term, of course, it's preventing. This is a matter of police, of intelligence, basically, but there's also a larger issue here, which is how far are we ready to infringement on civil liberties, circulation, liberty of movement, of privacy, etc. Of course, it's a big thing discussed in France currently. Another short to midterm issue is propaganda and trying to recover those people who are tempted jihadism. Another issue of the same kind is how to war coming back. And here we have actually, there is an experience in this, because each aftermath of war has brought back people that had become unadjusted to life, and you may think of Vietnam, for instance, the US, but it's a very general issue. But this will be, it's an issue that is also will become important in the near future. Another midterm challenge is knowledge. As I say, those issues are discussed by maybe a dozen specialists in France, because there has been a long term, after we left Algeria and other North African colonies, there was a lack of interest and there has been a steady decline in Islamic studies, with a small number of specialists. Of course, there's an effort by the government to try to new effort into knowledge of these of Islamic civilization, society. Of course, something that will only be fruitful in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And finally, most importantly, there's the issue of integrating Islam in a society like France, which very complex discussion, which I can go into right now, but it supposes that the modernist voices started to speak up within among the French Muslims, succeed in silencing the fundamentalist groups, and so there will be, and there is already a fight among French Muslims. It also involves stopping, and the government has started to do it, foreign interference of the mosque and the Muslim communities, and this is certainly the most daunting and necessary challenge of all.
Thank you, Penelope. So, Amar is going to setting up that thing. Start. Verdade. Ele vai usar o púlpito e aí a gente vai começar.
Vou usar o púlpito só porque tem papéis que eu quero ler. Também eu tentar agir com as lágrimas. Mas são imagens, ainda não vai fazer teste para as perguntas espectro. Imagens lindas e vocês querem as mesmas, né? Eu vou ficar mudando também. Tudo bem. Ok.
Boa tarde, estou super feliz por estar aqui na UF. Muito convite do professor Cante, da Flávia, que visitou nosso campus da Bárbara alguns meses atrás. Eu trabalhava lá na UF em 2003, 4 e 5, com meus colegas aqui, Paulo Gabriel, com quem fundei a União, o Núcleo de Estudos do Oriente Médio, com o professor Paulo. Então, fiquei muito feliz pelo convite para voltar. Então, queria só lançar algumas informações para vocês, porque faz parte do seminário. Então, era a rede de cooperação entre a gente, entre nossas instituições. Então, queria sublinhar que agora eu honra e responsabilidade horrível de ser o diretor de programas de programa de Global Studies. Global Studies não é relações internacionais, é programa interdisciplinário que mistura antropologia, história, economia política, mais ou menos sobre questões de direito. É literatura comparada, mas temos algumas questões, então, em comum. Então, é um programa fantástico para estudos interdisciplinários, especificamente sobre conflito, poder, grandes questões. Então, a gente tem agora o segundo ano do programa de doutorado. Agora, também sou coordenador do Núcleo de Estudos da Segurança Global, lá na Universidade de Califórnia, Santa Bárbara, onde Flávio veio participar no seminário. Ok, vamos começar. Então, hoje, depois de a gente assistir a apresentação sobre terrorismo, eu vou falar sobre amor. Mas, infelizmente, não é boa notícia. Na internet vai ter lado positivo, mas vou falar mais sobre a apropriação dos conceitos de amor por novas ondas de fascismo e populismo conservador. Vai ficar tomando lugar da justiça social e dos direitos humanos dentro do novo enquadramento e direito internacional, um pouco como o professor Bichara tem sublinhado. Então, o nome da apresentação é Políticas de Amor numa época de populismo autoritário. O objetivo geral da minha apresentação de hoje é analisar formas emergentes de discursos afetivos, identificações populistas e intervenções estatais configuradas explicitamente como doutrinas de amor. Estou argumentando que formas ressurgentes de autoritarismo em escala global empenham-se em colonizar com monstros de terror o nosso imaginário do futuro. Essas forças buscam capturar o pulsar da solidariedade com nacionalismos divisores e falsos puritanismos. No contexto histórico, a retomada do autoritarismo representa uma resposta violenta a um recente período de inovação política. Gerou 15 anos, por exemplo, de governos progressistas de centro-esquerda na América Latina. Atrás, o planeta vibrou com o entusiasmo das revoltas transregionais populares, como a Primavera Árabe ou Revoluções Árabes, resultando nos maiores protestos civis na história da humanidade, como em Cairo, por exemplo. Nos Estados Unidos também, tal período sustentou a ascensão do movimento Occupy, as revoltas nacionais contra o racismo e a violência e o genocídio estatal e racial, como o movimento que importa, os Black Lives Matter, além da campanha presidencial de Bernie Sanders, que ajudou a consolidar uma consciência de justiça social ligada às reflexões com o socialismo e que atualmente é abraçada por uma forte maioria da população com menos de 30 anos. Então, estamos vendo como em muitos países que estamos na porta de uma nova geração totalmente diferente, revolucionária, que tem consciência tão ligada, engajada com diversidade, com justiça social. E nesse momento, estamos vendo uma reação que vai tampar todo esse futuro. Então, quando estou falando de autoritarismo, estou falando de uma contra-revolução, uma série de tipos de golpe no mundo inteiro, que não é porque não tem alternativa. Está chegando, está por chegar, então tem uma reação forte. O amor é muito importante, porque toma lugar dessas esperanças e essas solidariedades. Porém, não há dúvida que são a progressismo, essa época de inovações e novas gerações tão diversas e inovadoras, elementos políticos combinando nacionalismo, pânico moral e autoritarismo securitário tomaram de assalto as esferas públicas. Mas qual é a razão dessa reação tão celere e tão global? E como tais modificações políticas conseguiram seduzir a coração de milhões? Essas modificações autoritárias recentemente. Quais discursos e mobilizações políticas convenceram parte da população que apoiaram meses atrás, ou 2 anos atrás, só uma política totalmente revolucionária, progressista, de juventude? As mesmas populações, em alguns meses, apoiam a Sisi, o presidente autoritário no Egito, apoiam Trump nos Estados Unidos, apoiam o impeachment aqui. Quais discursos e mobilizações políticas convenceram partes da população a derrubar sua própria soberania popular, suas instituições democráticas e suas normas jurídicas? Outros pesquisadores, jornalistas investigativos, têm analisado o poder dos interesses financeiros em mobilizar a reação. Também, como a gente falou muito ontem, o papel da mídia foi papelizado e as capacidades de pequenos círculos de elites que geralmente têm capacidade de mudar as narrativas da empresa, os interesses do setor financeiro. Então, temos lido muito sobre essas dimensões. Tais reflexões são esclarecedoras e convincentes. A explosão de umas emoções de massa e de apoio afetivo para políticas autoritárias e inquisitórias, como também discutiu amanhã, podem ser aplicados ao se rastrear o fluxo de dinheiro, informações e imagens. E não é só isso. Temos que entender mais esse lado emocional e afetivo, essa volta tão rápido, emocional, de raiva que tem acontecido quase todo o mundo inteiro. De forma a compreender as capacidades dessa nova ou recente forma articulada de política global, eu acredito que também é necessário investigar o poder e a utilidade de novas formas de ódio e medo em seus próprios termos. O mais importante, conforme eu insisto nós devemos confrontar a natureza política e o poder social de uma força que cientistas sociais ainda mais intimidante, o medo. Essa é a força. Em períodos de golpes e revoluções e contra-revoluções globais, o discurso de amor está no ar. Esse gigantesco fantasma rosa está assombrando todos esses fenômenos políticos. Esse anjo de amor tem chegado ainda no Brasil, mas vamos falar disso depois. Vocês não querem. Em 2016, o Papa Francisco, você ouviu falar, publicou Ele é argentino, problema, né? É jesuíta. Publicou um manifesto revolucionário que se chama Amores Letícia, a alegria de amor. O manifesto vaticano propagandeava uma nova doutrina de amor centrada em se reviver o papel da orientação pastoral. A pastoral rejeitava explicitamente a rigidez excessiva em termos de papéis de gênero, em termos de papéis de corpos de gênero, e se distanciava do tom condenatório das doutrinas de João Paulo II. Segundo, porém, a alegria do amor ainda proíbe rigidamente que mulheres assumiram papéis de liderança na igreja, assim como proibindo uniões de casais do mesmo sexo, proibindo direitos reprodutivos e aborto para mulheres. Mas tomou um novo discurso que não é proteção da família, que é a alegria do amor. Autoritarismo, não, mas nova autoridade carismática para o pastoralismo. Do outro lado do Mediterrâneo, do Vaticano, outra doutrina política de amor. Outra doutrina política de amor foi articulada em um país que se transformou em um símbolo global de manifestações civis, ações violentas militares entre 2011 e 2013. Em 2015, em Egito, o presidente, o general militar Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, perseguia dissidentes políticos e esmagava partidos políticos opositores. Ao mesmo tempo que tomava tais ações, o presidente iniciou uma nova agenda educacional para as escolas e as faculdades, com forte caráter nacionalista, educacional, denominada o do amor. Essa é a ideia que é ensinar os alunos desde secundária e universidade de não ter um foco sobre cidadania e direitos individuais e desenvolvimento do indivíduo, mas em desenvolvimento o amor para a nação, o amor para a estabilidade da Constituição do líder. Então, vai exprimir sua identidade não como cidadão que quer direitos, porque isso é conflituoso. Você não quer conflito, você quer amor. a agenda de soberania popular da Revolução Árabe, dos protestos de 2011, que era a ideia de amor civil, amor cívico, como participação direta e na rua, agora ficou amor do Egito, ficou abandonar a cidadania, abandonar essa conflituosidade. Estar na rua e para fazer performance exaustivo de sociedade. Ele vai receber mais se você amar mais. Então, se você... próximo no Egito é aliado do novo governo. Então, esse é o novo partido, a coalição que elegeu o presidente Sisi, autoritário militar, depois da Revolução no Egito. A coalição do partido se chama Apaixonado por Egito, ou o Amor para Egito. Também esse é o cartaz para as eleições para o partido o Amor para Egito. Também tem slogan a Revolução de Liberdade. Mas liberdade quer dizer da política, liberado da cidadania. Você vai ficar na mão daquele carismático homem. Então, nos Estados Unidos, próximo ao Egito, é aliado do novo governo. A Arábia Saudita iniciava uma campanha 15, bem aliado bem coordenado com o Sisi, onde ele se denominou o Rei dos Corações. Campanha nacional para manifestação que envolvia execuções em massa de oponentes do governo, além do grotesco bombardamento de alvos civis no Iêmen. Estaria ele, Salman, da Arábia Saudita, baseando seu regime de humor na luta, rainha de corações da obra Alice no país? Exatamente no padrão. Ele tem misturado essa ideia de rei de corações com essa ideia de firme. Então, firmeza e amor se mistura necessariamente nessa doutrina. Estados Unidos, em junho de 2015, a população lidava a legalização do casamento homossexual, ao mesmo tempo mobilizava para atacar o horror representado pelo grupo Estado Islâmico, Daesh. Está falando agora. Neste contexto, o presidente Obama encontrava um novo nome, estilo de presidencialismo americano. Um grande discurso para a nação no dia da legalização do casamento homossexual, chamou o exercício específico de Obama, trovões, raios de amor. Love. Trovões de amor, ou raios, relâmpagos de amor. Tal metáfora, ainda não bem lá. Tal metáfora, esse trovões, raios de amor, que falou Obama, estava relacionado com o incrível e benevolente poder dos gregos Zeus. Thunderbolts em inglês, mais ou menos só usado como Zeus para raio da tempestade. Tal metáfora estava relacionado com o incrível e benevolente poder do Deus grego Zeus, governando do amor, liderando seus com combinação de ativismo jurídico na Corte Suprema e de ataques vindos do alto com drones de alta tecnologia. Então, Obama tem misturado a ideia dos drones como alternativo social com a ideia das rulings, das decisões da Corte Suprema, como também drones e relâmpagos do céu benevolentes, coisa boa, porque é relâmpagos de amor. O beijo do drone, muito amador. Então, como a gente sabe, em 2016, a campanha conservadora do populista Donald Trump para presidente do EUA também falou na linguagem do humor. O discurso de Trump prega por uma filosofia de amor bruto, com seus apoiadores brandindo cartazes constantemente com frases como: essa doutrina particular apoia a agressão, justifica e demanda agressão contra manifestantes, violência policial, literalmente, veneração de violência policial, onde exógenos bilionários. Em oposta a doutrinas de amor bruto, Hillary Clinton adotou explicitamente o tema da campanha dela, Love Trumps Hate. Triunfo contra ódio, mas também quer dizer alguma coisa, jogo de palavras com a palavra Trump, que quer dizer triunfar, mas com trunfo, não é triunfar, trunfar. Exatamente, mas também tem essa ideia de triunfar, mas com truque de cartas, né? Então é jogo, mas também tem vitória, mas é vitória com jogo de cartas. Pronto. Mas o slogan de Hillary, que ficou oficial, Love Trump's Hate, sugeria que o Partido Democrático era mais inclusivo, menos racista, misógino, além de mais carinhoso que o de Trump, que seria a personificação do oposto de tais valores. Porém, sua completa articulação, a doutrina de amor de Hillary também se revelou com um programa de segurança nacional. Nas noções de então candidata se manifestavam numa visão de proteção militarizada, patriotismo materno e um gerenciamento seguro do estoque de armamentos nucleares do país. Então, o Love Trump's Hate ficou uma agenda para sair da política de justiça social, da campanha com Bernie Sanders, para entrar totalmente na campanha de segurança nacional, que chamou, depois foi nomeado. Então, vamos falar um pouco sobre detalhes dessas doutrinas. Okay. Primeiro, esses trovões raios de amor de Obama. Em 26 de junho de 2015, uma cobertura midiática ensandecida comparava uma vitória de amor no que seria um sucesso liberal e jurídico de uma era em Washington, D.C., com o julgamento neo-inquisitor, braços da morte em Mosul, no Iraque. Essa justa posição definia o que parecia ser uma nova geração de um conflito nunca vou falar isso, civilizacional. Eu tenho alergia a esse conceito de civilização. Eu posso falar, proibido para minha boca. Esse conflito civil entre Ocidente e Oriente. Esse movimento articulava de maneira explosiva políticas de sexualidade e vigilantismo sectário, numa espécie de reinauguração da guerra ao terror. Esse dia de junho de 2015 serviu como ponto culminante do que alguns ativistas LGBT denominaram revolução de relacionamento. Por 5 votos contra 4, a Suprema Corte dos Estados Unidos decidiu, no caso Obergefell contra Hodge, que a quarta emenda exige que o Estado permita casamento de pessoas do mesmo sexo. Contudo, que esse direito específico ao casamento era garantido, a sua legalidade foi rejeitada da maneira espetacular. O termo casamento foi varrido e perdido numa discussão mais ampla que buscava oferecer uma nova legitimidade para o Estado liberal e para o projeto norte-americano de liberdade global. O regime global foi iniciado chamando-se mesmo não de direitos humanos para gays, mas chamando-se Trovão Raio de Amor. Então, Trovão de Amor, então é o novo Império Americano de Amor. As ruas de West Hollywood, Califórnia, milhares de homens e mulheres, eu inclusive, agitavam bandeiras onde podia ler o Love Rules. Love Rules quer dizer que a decisão pro-amor da Suprema Corte, mas também Love Rules quer dizer que o amor é soberano, governa, domínio do amor, governa. Então, rules em inglês muito falar de soberania do corte sobre o... Ok. Imaginava ainda que talvez a decisão pudesse servir na fundação para enfraquecer fobias e criando estruturas civis e criminais. Antes, em 23 de maio, ativistas definiram um referendo nacional sobre casamento do mesmo sexo como movimento do sim, com amor. É impressionante, ativistas do movimento LGBT de justiça social declararam a fundação da República do Amor, em Irlanda. Eles descreveram a vitória como uma derrubada revolucionária de um regime moralista católica de austeridade patriarcal. Então, essa é a versão de amor cívico que vem de embaixo entre militantes de Irlanda. Mas quando foi apropriado pelo Obama e pela Corte Suprema nos Estados Unidos, depois para Hillary Clinton, essa ideia de a decisão do corte, então ficou no vitória para amor cívico e solidariedade social, mas para nova legitimação dos Estados Unidos como império de comunistas que vão ser executados de em cima para o regime presidencial. Então, vou soltar um pouco. Então, tem o discurso do juiz Kennedy, que ele fala, ele criou esse discurso jurídico de fundamentalismo de casamento, baseado na noção que casamento gay pode ser muito novo, mas o amor é eterno, e se você não tem amor, você é totalmente abandonado, não tem sociedade, só tem amor, o abandono individual. Então, essa ideia de amor é como então, acabar com a possibilidade de ter social entre o indivíduo abandonado e o casamento, que é a única instituição social que existe. Então, a vitória do casamento gay também um grande desastre para a ideia de justiça social, não porque não tinha nada a ver com gay ou não, mas porque o discurso de amor com um discurso oposto à ideia de justiça social. Mas então, no mesmo dia de junho, os trovões norte-americanos não eram as únicas revoluções em cascada do céu. No Levante, um show de horror como o oposto desta nova doutrina de amor político, explicitamente posto como de novo doutrina de Obama. A imprensa bradava que o Estado Islâmico responde à vitória de amor de maneira terrível, falou na imprensa. Um vídeo online projetava cenas cruéis e com alto grau de intimidade, forneceu um espelho sinistro dos abraços e beijos em frente à Suprema Corte. Os vídeos do Estado Islâmico fundiram as execuções de junho com cenas cometidas um mês antes. Os sorridentes do Estado Islâmico abraçaram de forma adolescente dados. O canal de notícias Fox News, assim como a televisão egípcia, rotularam esses gestos como abraços. Os jornalistas analisaram esses abraços como o último estágio de uma forma brutal de sedução em que lutadores sensuais do Estado Islâmico e homossexuais, servindo como isca, eroticamente e assim incriminaram-se a ser condenado à morte. A representação desses abraços da morte que são com fantasias de aprisionamento erotizado, bem como reminiscências do amor cruel do inquisidor cristão que abraça ou beija o condenado enquanto são levados à morte, mesmo quando eles são levados à sua morte. Então, estou falando que articula, então, os dois lados desse mesmo paradigma novo de intimidade e amor como nova forma de imperialismo e como forma de horror anti-imperial. Que os dois lados, então, evacuam, deixa vazio toda a política e toda a história de luta social, de luta para a justiça social, que nos Estados Unidos em 2015, entre a comunidade gay lésbica, entre o movimento de Bernie Sanders e no Egito, no Oriente Médio, entre os novos movimentos sociais, que não tem nada a ver, que são exatamente opostos a grupos como o Estado Islâmico. Trump um pouco, espero que tenha um pouco de tempo. Tudo bem, vamos chegar. Então, Trump é o amor bruto. Estou certo, vocês estão cientes da chocante campanha presidencial de Donald Trump, que poderá ser eleito presidente dos Estados Unidos em 7 semanas. Este mega empresário e oligarca tomou de assalto o Partido Republicano, uma coalizão que une as inseguranças legítimas da classe trabalhadora e da classe média norte-americana com pareias, incluindo supremacistas brancos e neonazistas, até mesmo uma parceria explícita com o presidente russo Vladimir Putin. Muitos dos seus apoiadores se mostram extremamente desconfortáveis com essas alianças, mas estão dispostos a aceitá-los, indiferencia um profundo sentimento de afinidade supraracional por Trump. Apreciam o que é percebido como a autenticidade da sua raiva e ódio, que é muitas vezes articulada fundamentalmente e paradoxalmente como doutrina de amor. Trump pode ser dividido em 3 esferas. O amor como uma lógica de proteção securitizada, que protege de rivais, em vez de uma lógica de redistribuição de energias, recursos e meios de participação. 2. O amor de Trump pode ser visto como soberania absoluta de vencedores, defesa liberal e feminizada de perdedores. 3. O amor de Trump é amor para a polícia mais que de lei, é onde na imaginação de Trump, policiamento quer dizer a implantação de força armada não regulamentada e a regularização de práticas de tortura que são vistas como essencial para a visão de policiamento de Trump. Curiosamente, embora esta doutrina proclame o nacionalismo e o patriotismo, não há nada de positivo a dizer sobre os Estados Unidos mesmo. Então, vou soltar. Das 3 partes da doutrina de amor bruto de Trump é uma doutrina de muros, muro literal entre os Estados Unidos e México, parente de entrada de imigrantes criminosos. Então, vou ter um pouco de tempo para falar de... Então, mas então esse lado racial, como Trump nesse famoso está falando que ele ama todos os hispânicos e vai demonstrar o amor para os hispânicos por comer esse taco imenso. E depois, então essa coisa de comer para ele é a única coisa de expressão de amor que ele consegue os imigrantes ou minorias raciais. Também, depois de um mês atrás, um representante ligado com a campanha dele falou que se Hillary é elegida, a gente vai ter um vendedor de tacos em cada esquina. Visão de horror. Mais uma vez, essa ideia de comida, de violência racial e comendo o outro, um pouco como vocês sabem muito bem, no país de antropofagia, né? Então, também tem essa ideia de então, a ideia de proteção autêntica de Trump, que fala que vai proteger os gays e lésbicas, não vai empoderar os gays e lésbicas, vai protegê-los especificamente do terrorismo. Uma aliança perversa, e com certeza, fala Gabriel, você vai reconhecer essa aliança, então, entre os gays neoconservadores e os cristãos árabes, porque eles acham que vão proteger as minorias contra o terrorismo. Mas fora da questão de proteger contra o terrorismo, não tem nenhuma doutrina de empoderamento legal ou redistribuição econômica e proteção contra o terror ou te comer como taco. Então, essa ideia de amor é muito específica. A humana de Hillary, um pouco sobre isso, para terminar. Candidata presidencial do Hillary Clinton entre novembro de 2015 até julho desse ano, focou sua campanha em lidar com os desafios dentro do Partido Democrata promovidos a uma larga escala por Bernie Sanders, um autodeclarado socialista. Durante a disputa principal entre os dois, suas propostas políticas e os discursos dos candidatos, somente sobre questões socioeconômicas. Isso é não amor, né? Sanders foi capaz de definir os termos da campanha, que se concentrou na luta contra os interesses instalados do capital financeiro e das empresas multinacionais. A gratuidade do ensino secundário e dos tratamentos de saúde universalmente acessível. Então, a conversa para um ano era sobre educação acessível, saúde acessível, universidade de graça, justiça social, acabando com o poder financeiro de Wall Street. Esse era o debate. 90 minutos depois de Bernie Sanders ceder a nomeação para presidente para Hillary Clinton, ela parou de falar sobre justiça social e essa fase de falar mais ou menos só sobre segurança nacional, com a transição entre justiça social e segurança nacional sendo essa coisa de amor, proteger o público, não mais de empoderar e dar redistribuição, mas quer dizer proteção militar. Então, Love Trump's Hate tornou-se o slogan da convenção para a nomeação presidencial do Partido Democrata, além do tema inicial da campanha de Clinton. Então, tem que terminar, né? Ok. Então, tem o general John Allen das Forças Armadas falando com todos os veteranos, soldados americanos de toda raça, toda religião. A gente somos um país com segurança nacional baseado na diversidade e inclusão. Então, é amor e dado por um geral das Forças Armadas, mas um amor de diversidade. Esse tipo de amor que vai ter como pilar ao centro Forças Armadas, mas vai incluir a diversidade. Então, mas não tem nada a ver com a campanha de Bernie Sanders, que era justiça e proteção militar. Então, evoluiu desde Love Trump's Hate até Stronger Together, que é como uma coisa de saudita, que ficou o Melek do Ayub, coração, até o rei de firmeza. Então, amor e firmeza se misturou. Resumo rápido, então a gente falou sobre Trovão Raio de Amor de Obama, super soberania do judiciário, misturando com o liberalismo olímpico dos tipos domínio de drones, mas também rejeita esses movimentos que dominam a juventude agora, que não quero só drones, que é uma nova perspectiva desde embaixo de paz civil, participação direta da cidadania, é uma questão universal, não só nacionalista. movimentos em Egito, na filosofia, etc. Colocando raça e pobreza no centro, não nacionalismo e proteção de direitos mesmo. Amor bruto de Trump, como a gente falou, também de cidadania e soberania, ideia de super soberania dos vencedores. Quer dizer, a supremacia branca, evidentemente, ou explicitamente. A Clinton, militarizada, então, rejeitou todo esse ano de discurso sobre justiça social para colocar no meio discurso de segurança nacional. Esquece ou deixa à margem essa política de desigualdade e participação de cidadão. E, finalmente, o discurso do presidente autoritário de Egito, como nesse árabe, tem essa ideia de tortura e amor, um pouco como Clinton. Ele falou um grande discurso onde falou que para o país você tem que se disciplinar sempre para amar o país e para abandonar suas resistências e seus narcisismos individuais. Então, se você tem problema em o amor para o país, a gente vai ficar tocando na porta de cada indivíduo e vamos entrar e vamos ajudar vocês em se disciplinar e abandonar suas resistências. Então, no final do discurso, ele falou Sisi, em nome do presidente, ele falou Sisi é tortura. A gente vai chegar o amor juntos, mesmo se sofre muito. O discurso inquisitor do amor, tortura, o amor, a enfermeza juntos. Conclui aqui, mas por sublinhar, esse amor é o discurso da revolução global, visto desde o ano 2008, 2010, novos tipos de participação, novos tipos de inclusão de diversidade, novas incorporações de gênero e raça, senso de política e resistência. Então, esse amor é esse jogo sobre os espaços de ocupação, sobre os amores cívicos e solidariedades sociais, que, como o professor Bichara tem falado, a gente não pode só reclamar, tem que reapropriar esse amor cívico como resistência a esse autoritarismo. Então, muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, Mar. Bem, passo diretamente, então, para o Paulo Gabriel para os comentários.
Because everybody here is English speakers here also. But I first excuse myself because I'm having a post-flu asthma attack. So if I start coughing or faint or die, it's nothing personal. Yeah. Well, I'll start with the wonderful presentation of George Bichara. Very enlightening about the uses of Zionist Israeli organizations, the uses of humanitarian law on the interest of keeping the colonization and of the Palestinians going. I agree fully with the whole analysis. I just wanted to ask you when this consciousness that they had to fight back on the court started, that the first organization was created in 2003. It reminded me that Ariel Sharon was attempted to be tried in Brussels, a trial that embarrassed the Belgian authorities because the International Court in Brussels was created for the war crimes in Rwanda. And they got very pleased and they said, well, we're going to try all war crimes all over the world. And the next case was by Palestinian organizations that Ariel Sharon should be tried by Sabra Shatil. And because, of course, Eliyahu Beika said that he would testimony in the court. And then, in the end, Eliyahu Beika was murdered mysteriously. And the court decided that they could not rule. So maybe this was the starting point. I don't know. I mean, it's a question. And the other thing is about power. Will not compensate political powerlessness, but how do you get this power? And that's, I think, the main question, because of course, also the Palestinian establishment, more than the Palestinian movement, relied on the political establishment and trying to convince presidents and the UN or something like that to, and never worked, of course. And recently I saw in the US this shift on the conflict. And of course you have all these debates about BDS, and several professional associations, they adopted BDS. The American Studies Association adopted BDS in 2015, and the American Anthropological Association voted for later on an online vote rolled out the BDS. So I think there is this shifting ground in the American society. And just to give you a parallel, these things would be impossible here. I mean, in the Brazilian Anthropological Association, even to condemn the bombing of Gaza was hysterical, almost never, and could not go to vote. Of the Brazilian Anthropological Association didn't put the motion to vote, just said it would be approved by ovation, and people applaud, and that wasn't. The political climate was impossible. So I think in the US things are shifting very fast, so maybe talk more about that. So I'll make my comments on to René Lévy. Yes, your overview of the French debate on the jihadist terrorist issue. I mean, I just wanted to raise one thing is these attacks, they are attributed. That's how Al-Qaeda worked. Al-Qaeda never ever claimed before the press claimed for it. And then it said, yeah, we did it, that's fine. And many of these attacks, they have scanty associations or quite complicated associations with Daesh. For instance, in Orlando, on the gay nightclub, I mean, the guy for the phone that he had some connections to Daesh, but there was nothing to prove in his life or his previous life, etc. And in Nice also, the guy who ran the truck over people, he had no knowledge of religion at all. I mean, what actual connection he had to Daesh, if ever he had an actual connection to Daesh. So I think we are dealing with a very complicated issue. That it doesn't mean that Daesh doesn't plan or organize, but Daesh maybe is like Al-Qaeda, is more a political vocabulary. Your actions on an international arena or a global arena, or to amplify your actions, rather than some actual organization that says, now, and you will do that other day, and here's the money for this, and here's the money for that. So maybe, because Al-Qaeda actually, as long we treat Al-Qaeda with branches and all that, because Al-Qaeda have branches in Madrid, Mumbai, Casablanca, and New York, and etc. Tackle so this about the phenomenon itself, and about the scholars, and France, of course, is very unlikely to be the target of those horrible attacks, but it's very lucky to have those intellectuals. I mean, best thinking about jihadism comes out of France. And you mentioned them, Olivier Roy and Gilles Pepel. You tend to accept self-claim as the main scholar on the issue. There is a lot of criticism on the way he portrays Salafism. Portrayed it accurately, because in the Salafi universe, and Salafism is something as evangelical Christianity, you have apolitical Salafism, which is, I would say, 99.99% of the Salafis in France or elsewhere. And then you have jihadism. And then you have things like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is not Salafi, but comes out of Salafism, with a political program that it says will never be implemented. So it's a very complicated phenomenon to say simply, well, the problem is Salafism. And when he says that, he of course puts the whole range of French Salafis, which is a very vast population in France, under suspect. So another, a very harsh criticism of him comes from Stéphane Lacroix, who speaks Arabic and who did fieldwork in Saudi Arabia, and has this wonderful book, Le Salafisme Saoudien. So it's more complicated. And of course, Olivier Roy doesn't speak Arabic, but he speaks Persian. Afghanistan, so he actually saw, he has, let's say, fieldwork experience that Gilles Kepel never had. So, I mean, I would say that neither theses are mutually exclusive. And some phenomenon would maybe cling more to the Islamization of radicalism, and others would go more for radicalization of Islam, of course, or some aspects of the phenomenon in both this or that. And to Paul Amar, this wonderful presentation as usual. One thing that, of course, appears in your presentation in the very beginning is that the notion of love comes from religion and was very much taught about in religious contexts. And of course, it reminds me of Saint Augustine. Is compele entrare, is to force people to enter the right path. The church, of course, and in the Muslim world, of course, even Arabic, to love is to be annihilated in the Creator. So the interesting thing is what happens when these notions become political notions or part of the political vocabulary. And one thing that struck me, of course, I don't think they are new, and I don't think they are just right-wing. I mean, I live in Baathist Syria, and in front of my apartment there was this huge billboard, "Fi qulubina hubb, la ka'idna ila lawad." In our hearts there is love to our leader for eternity, and supposedly a socialist state. So the interesting thing about love, of course, I think the important reference here is the Charles Lindholm book on charisma. Charisma is a form of love. So love also engenders charisma. I think it's a good to get there because it fits very well to all these examples. And Stalin also talked about love all the time. And people in all totalitarian, authoritarian states will love the leader or whatever, left wing or right wing, it doesn't matter. So, and of course, shared or diffused in society, like love in Ireland, created, and can be in one figure, so you have to love it, are incapable of loving, so they have to be taught how to be loved. To love, like Sis is doing in Egypt, really teaching people how to love. And so I think that would be a nice thing to explore a little bit, the connection between love and charisma in discourse. We will express that and reinvent that, actually not saying what it's meant to say, to be said, because love is a very powerful symbol that comes from all experiential range of people. So that would be it. I didn't call.
Thank you, Paulo. So you're going to collect the questions and then come back to answers. Alguma pergunta, algum comentário de parte do público, por favor? Ok, então, George, your time.
Paulo, thank you for these questions. Yes, I think there were, so I 2000, as the kind of the beginning of this process. And I think there were several things that converged at that point, or roughly at that point, to create this drive. And certainly the attempted prosecution of Ariel Sharon, who was at the time Prime Minister of Israel, was one of those events. And as I'm sure you're aware, there were other attempted prosecutions, and at times an arrest warrant issued for an Israeli general. There was, it was landing in Heathrow Airport and declined to get off the airplane because of fear of arrest. And there was for a brief period of time, there was an arrest warrant also issued in the UK for Tzipi Livni, for her role as defense minister in one of the attacks, the cast-led attack on the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009. So those were very influential. The other thing, however, and the reason I dated it slightly earlier was because that was the beginning of the second Palestinian Intifada. There were, if any of you recall, the first Intifada that occurred in the late 1980s and early 90s, that was I call it wasn't a non-violent movement of resistance, but it was an unarmed movement of resistance for the most part. Palestinians had stones and makeshift, Molotov cocktails at most in those early confrontations. And that was Intifada led to a very significant uptick in sympathy for Palestinian rights and interests and understanding of it. The situation in 2000 was different in the sense that the Palestinian created, and there were Palestinians there were police and other Palestinians who had guns, and so some of those people started participating in the second uprising using their arms. Israel, of course, saw this as a great opportunity to militarize the conflict, but it couldn't do so under sort of standard principles of humanitarian law and the laws of occupation. And it started at that time to try to engineer these transformations of international humanitarian law. So that was the other event that was kind of independent of the prosecutions and things. So that's my reason for dating it to that period. Power and how do you get it? You get it by persuasion, by forming alliances, by offering solidarity, by organizing, by demonstrating, by giving up lives, by ways that popular movements achieve power, and also by boycott, divestment, and sanction is a form of power. How great a power it is, and how complete a power it is as a sort of a tool for delivery of Palestinian rights and interests, that remains to be seen. There probably much more has to be done. But there is certainly a heightened sense, I think, on the all of these organizations that I mentioned. Well, organizations I mentioned are very alarmed by BDS. That's why there is this effort to go elite structures, basically, to try to get all of this legislation to criminalize support for BDS in the United States. It is precisely because of the political shifts that you're talking about, of which they are acutely aware, that these efforts are being made at the elite level. That's where they have their power. That's where they have their resources, and that's where they can be successful. But it is because of these shifts. And just to quickly reference a couple of the major visible at this time, there's a very sharp political divide, partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans, and there, as many as 49% of Democrats polled recently would actually support boycott, divestment. Well, they would support sanctions against Israel if in the event that it fails to comply with international. It's a number that had never been seen before on the Democratic side. Republicans are very strongly supportive of Israel in every respect, but that's a major shift for one of the two parties. The other far more troubling shift to the supporters of Israel is the generational shift, and under 30 are far more understanding of and sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than Americans have ever been in history, and that's the shift that they see coming. The boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in the United States is strongest in academic institutions. Obviously the organizations that you cited are academic organizations, and the campuses themselves, the students on the campuses, are very supportive of this movement. So and the movement. There have been repeated resolutions at universities in the United States, including to pass BDS or boycott, divestment, sanction resolutions affecting the university, and so that's what's triggering this strong reaction.
Well, thank you, Paolo, for your questions. They're very interesting because they're very difficult to answer, actually. So, the first question is about whether those attacks are really, whether ISIS is really responsible for those attacks. Now, what I say, if you remember, I say they've been claimed by ISIS, which means that you have a variety of cases because you have different, those various attacks have different levels, right? At the November attack, November 2015, were made by a group. There were 9 people that were part of a network that was across France and Belgium, which then committed the attacks in Brussels. And it is clear that here you have something that's organized, and that it is likely that it's been thought of back in Syria with operators that had a definite, quite clear, definite plan, because the targets were not chosen at random at all. In other cases, you have people who commit attacks and they have a leaflet with them saying they're doing it in the name of and then ISIS later on says, yeah, he did it for us in our name, and we claim responsibility for it, which doesn't mean that they organized it, okay? But in numerous cases, what has appeared is that in the latest attacks, for instance, the police, the couple of police who were killed, the priest who was killed, those who were just arrested, the 4 women actually, because of preparing an attack, and they were all in connection with an operator who was in Syria. So there was a kind of remote control through networks, especially now, currently it's a Telegram application. So here you have a link, clearly a link with operators in Syria too. How far they went in practically organizing it is another issue, because you must, and this is a peculiarity of, I think, of ISIS compared to perhaps to Al-Qaeda, decentralized, and they are actually encouraging people to do local jihad. This the alleged number 2 of ISIS, Al-Adnani, was just killed last month, I think. He had launched an appeal saying to all Muslims they should take what they had at their hands and just attack their neighbor. Okay? So this is, you can't speak of organizing attacks, but they can claim them later on, say, we told them to do it. I rushed through my paper at the end, but I had a point which was about, when I say that for French scholars it is difficult to admit motive in those attacks. One reason is that some of the people who commit them do not appear as practicing Muslims at all. For instance, but also some of the guys who were involved in the November attack, in the Bataclan attacks, etc. They didn't lead an Islamic life. They had sex, they took drugs, they drank alcohol, etc., etc. So there are two, in the currently debates, there are two interpretations about it. One is, well, it was a disguise. I mean, it's part of undercover operation that you don't make yourself visible, because you would be, if you look like a practicing Muslim, then the police will spot you. Okay? So that's one interpretation. Another interpretation, which is not incompatible, is that tell militants that it doesn't matter if they take life, because what they will be doing them, okay, and they will be forgiven for all their sins because they've killed unbelievers, done those attacks. So these are the two debates. I cannot say which one is true. Now to the second question. Yeah, well, that's as I said, another I cannot tell whether there is a good Islam or a bad Islam, or a good and a bad Salafism. I'm just trying to sketch the various positions, and here again there is a debate about this. Many intellectuals from Arab countries, for instance, are much, well, don't believe should make a distinction between a good Salafism and a bad Salafism. It's bad, period. Okay? You have the case of an imam who is now under investigation. He is a young guy in his 20s in Brittany, in France. I don't remember his name, but he's very popular because he has lots of videos on the internet, which I watched, and kind of a very exuberant, and he speaks in a mixture of French and Arabic. It's quite funny. After the Charlie attacks in January 2015, he condemned them. Okay, and he said, "Well, those guys are stupid. Look what they did. What good did they do to the Muslims? Now all Muslims are suspects, etc., etc." So he was quite clear about his views. On the other hand, this is the guy who tells small children because singing is sin. It's a matter of discussion and perhaps of empirical research whether educating in this way will or not later on lead them to something else. It's like the debate earlier whether if you started smoking pot, would you then go up to heroin? Okay, a big discussion in the 70s about drugs, with the theory of escalation. Okay, so is there an escalation within Islam or not? We don't know, actually. I mean, it will be, I think it's an at at present, there are strong internal strife, conflicts within the Islamic world. Of course, there are forms of fundamentalism that are more, let's say, retreatist, like more of like the Sufi, for instance, who tend to, retreat, keep by themselves, isolate themselves, etc. But whether there is a bridge between this and a more violent forms is a matter of debate, and I think of research probably.
Just very, yeah. So fantastic comments, and I hope I get to talk to you more about annihilation by the Creator, which sounds wonderful after a long day. So yeah, but I would love to explore more. Obviously, not to accept a exclusively juridical populist origin for these terms, but also, of course, look into the religious doctrines. Of course, both the long Puritan history of love and punishment, and of course, until Scalia in the court, was dominated. Actually, we don't think of the United States as dominated by Catholic canon law, but we really were under Scalia. So, but I think, though it's what I'm hypothesizing is that this isn't just people talking about, oh, we love the leader, and about charisma. It's kind of a surprising and sudden, complete reoccupation, social, by this formation of love. I mean, in 30 years of activism in LGBT rights, the rights out there, but it wasn't the basis of the legal arguments. It was either pragmatic arguments about we need insurance, people in the hospital, need recognition and dignity. But the whole thing became the right to love, and if you're not loved, then you're abandoned and dead on the street. Like social concerns in between. There's no notions of race or class or privilege. So, and then you see this repeated, Cece's not just saying like, love me, I'm a great guy. A political party called Love, a school doctrine called Love, a new ideology for the nation called Love, and not called, not called like popular sovereignty, bread, and justice, which is the agenda 5 minutes ago that everyone was talking about. Those words are banned. Love is all you can talk about. So it is charisma, but it's in so many different locations for a mix of popular sovereignty, a radicalization of the popular possibilities in the law, and of social justice concerns. So it's, in a sense, it is kind of like, it is the mirror of the way terror occupies the consciousness of the public sphere, but it's the different but opposite of that. And just, to think about that and to like fix our own, ways of thinking about that. It was circulating around Facebook some new studies about, in the United States at least, right? And we have had a lot of terrorist attacks recently, but, so 60 people have died of terrorist attacks in the last year in the United States. Children under the age of 8 have killed 353 people by accident. And 43,000 people in the United States have died from falling out of their beds. So again, the way we focus on particular problems of society is a particular hegemonic formation, articulation of security and the state, of the affective dimensions of power. It's not empirical. It is affective. We've chosen to fear and love certain things while utterly ignoring others, especially in the United States, like holistic masculinity, gun obsessions, which of course we share with Brazil. If we focused on masculinity and guns as the variable rather than which ethnicity you are, you know, where would that take us, or whether it's religion or not, and, you know. So anyway, so there's questions about affect that I think we really need to look at.
Thank you very much.
Mais alguém quer fazer algum comentário? A professora René quer fazer uma pergunta para o Omar.
Okay. Now I have two questions to Paul. Oh, I have a question and just a remark. One question is about love. I was thinking the Christian right, or the evangelists, you know, mega churches, etc., millions of people. I mean, those guys, they say love every second word, don't they? So somehow there must be, I mean, it permeates maybe in the whole American society somehow. And my second remark is about your last slide, the slide with the gays for Trump. Right. Now, according to certain surveys, to a number of surveys actually in France, more than 30% of married gay couples voting for Le Pen, which is, you know, the far-right petition. And the reason why is that she will protect them from Arabs who are gay haters. And that's that.
Guys, the point is that, as Paulo Gabriel reminded us of Chuck book on charisma, I was just reminding myself that the book is on romantic love and charisma. And romantic love, as we discussed it here, I don't know if it was yesterday or this morning or something like that, is a kind of individualistic feeling. Oh, it was the movie, about the movie that, okay. And I don't know about Egypt, but if you are talking about United States, I remember that when I was doing my Alabama with the police, the whole police was Baptist, you see, and they were very strict, and it was forbidden to, you see. So people were stuck because they want to make tourism and whatever and conventions, and they couldn't. So they had some loopholes to drinking. But anyway, it was a very, very strong feeling of this strictness that is kind of similar to the Muslim strictness. So I think that the United States and the steep feeling of religion in the United States and is quite similar to the and Levi-Strauss a long time ago said that it's not centrism, it's between things that are very similar, since they are not. And he was comparing the Anglican Church to the Catholic Church. That's the point. So I was just adding this kind of thing that kind of similar. You need to be, you need to create a difference, and that's the point of hating the similar and not loving. Love, your people, and they both and them and the other people. You create a contrast and between two similar human beings. This is one. The second thing is that when you say that love, because Americans say that they fall in love, something that we don't have a translation in Portuguese. And it seems that love is a condition, not a rational achievement. You say all this love that there's appeal to love in this political campaign, a little bit irrationality, because and not too rational, which contrasts a lot with what I've seen in the United States, the political campaigns, where I remember that Dukakis, the Greek American who was a candidate for governor of Massachusetts, he has his hands presas no púlpito, for not making gestures, because this would be, very irrational and appealing to the feelings of the people. And all this kind of the tradition that, the rhetoric should be very calm and quiet, because you're dealing with the facts and not with the feelings. And this is how much different this is from Brazilians and when they do politics and things like that. So it was, yeah, it's kind of a, no, it's more, yeah, it's an appeal to the feelings, not reason. Love seems like something very peculiar in an individualistic society, because individuals are very alone. Someone who it's very important, and being alone without this person is also a very lonely situation. And but at the same time, when they find these people, they fall in love. I mean, they lose their rational objectives and things. So I don't know about Egypt, but this other Western thing, I think it's, you will be able to think a lot more of this if you go to this kind of reasoning.